Cinematography is a mix of the technical and the creative. A key concept to finding that balance is lighting. American Cinematographer sits down with Chris Chomyn, ASC, in this interview to discuss all things lighting. Yeah, so I would love to start by talking about Lockdown.
Lockdown is a film in which three young African American men are convicted of a crime they didn't commit, and what being incarcerated does to them as friends, as individuals.
So one thing I really wanted to talk to you about was kind of, how you figured out the naturalistic style of lighting a lot of the day exterior work, where you really can feel how hot it is. You talked about like lighting accurately and not necessarily beautifully, making them look more beautiful. You can feel like the sheen of sweat and everything in that film. So how did you come about that lighting look?
Oh, so I think in early talks with the director, we talked about not trying to overly stylize it and make it kind of force the audience on this journey that they wouldn't want to go on themselves. We wanted to make it natural. We wanted to make it believable. The subject has come up. Is it different to photograph people with light skin versus dark skin? And the shortest answer is there's no difference. You're just photographing light reflecting off a subject, whether it's a person or a thing or whatever. But there is a difference because the way light reflects off things is different. I guess the best way I can say it is if you were photographing a car, if you're photographing a silver car, the light kind of hits the car and spreads, and it's kind of easy to photograph that car. You photograph a black car, you just end up seeing the points of light reflected in that car. And with darker skin, a lot of times, rather than using point sources, I've found using broader sources, bounces or whatever, because the skin is reflecting what's adjacent to it, what's lit near them. And I think that helps. So you want to make sure that you can see into their eyes and see what they're feeling emotionally, and you want to make them look appropriate to your story, whatever that is. So you want to see them. One example, I guess it's actually before the end of the swim meet, we see the white Mustang pull up to another convertible white Mustang, and we see the guy throw the gun in their car. The guy who killed the people placed it in their car. And this movie's been out for 20 years. I don't think it's too late for spoiler alerts. So we had the actor Sticky Fingers, who played Broadway, who committed the crime. He drives up and he throws it out, but we needed a closer shot, and he didn't look the same. He was doing another film at the time, and he had hair, and he couldn't shave his head because he couldn't grow it back in time for the thing. So we had one of our other guys on the crew be the driver in that, but he had a mustache and he didn't want to get rid of it. So this speaks to lighting. So I had to light it in such a way that you think it's the other guy, but I couldn't show any facial detail because you'd see his mustache.
Right.
So in the close-up, when he tosses the gun, it's actually somebody completely different. And you're pointing a camera at somebody in a close-up and not able to see his face. I think there's something interesting about that. But that was purely out of necessity. If I had had the real actor and he looked like he needed to for our film, I'm sure I would have lit his face.
Yeah.
Because it's so expressive. But the fact that we didn't have him, and so we had to find a solution, I almost think it's a better single image. And I kind of feel like if I had the real actor, I probably would have lit him and then wished I hadn't.
Yeah.
But sometimes the circumstances of what you're doing dictate how you do it.
Right.
And there's circumstances of what's in front of your camera, there's how much time do you have, what are your resources, all those things come into play. It's, when you're making a film on a budget, you're on a schedule and you have to get it done in that time. So you're making kind of complicated decisions sometimes at a really fast pace.
So with time constraints and budget constraints and how complicated it can be to control the sun as it moves throughout the day. What was your sensibility of how you were going to go about all of those prison scenes and everything outdoors where you were going to have to deal with the sun so much?
The prison was interesting because it was like in a U shape. And so one of the things we did early on is the art department built a wall across the opening of the U, so to make the yard enclosed on all sides. And there's of course fencing and barbed wire and stuff all around anyway, so even if in the actual prison, if somebody was in the yard and they're still on the grounds and they're still enclosed. But we made it even tighter. We wanted to make it even tighter. We took, in the cells were actually single inmate cells, and we put bunk beds in them and made them like in this tight space. Now you're putting twice as many people in here. It just turns the heat up on everything. Mm-hmm. Largely, we knew the sun always rises in the east and sets in the west, so we knew roughly where the sun would be at what time of day, and trying to figure out what time to shoot certain scenes. That's a given. And then it occurred to me that in one of the cell where one of our guys was, if you looked across, it was a 3 or 4 story high jail, and then there was floor to ceiling windows after a gap, and if you looked across through those, you could see green rolling hills. And then I thought, that gives you a sense of hope. I don't want to see those.
Yeah.
So when we were in that area, I made sure I overexposed the windows just enough so I didn't want it to look bad, but I didn't want to see the detail. I wanted to lose all that detail.
Right.
And not show the green hills. In the cell that Richard Jones was in, his cell faced part of the U shape of the prison, and out his window, you could see more prison. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't want to blow those windows out so much because I wanted to see the prison. And then I had to there's a very fine line between blowing them out and underexposing. It will look like 2 different places. Right. So I had to be like just on either side of that line. It's just blown out and it's just not.
Yeah.
And then of course, when we're in the cells that we built, I had to blow out everything because there was nothing behind them, so we did that.
So, talking about how small and cramped they are, how did you go about trying to light in that space?
If I remember correctly, because I also had to move very quickly, I had the electricians basically tape a KinoFlow tube high up on, like a 4-foot tube on the longer walls, and like maybe a 2-foot tube on the others, and where the bars open up to the windows, I probably had an HMI or something bouncing, and so I don't remember exactly, and all the wires led outside the cell, so I could turn any light on or off that I wanted when I wanted it. So as we would get to, or we'd do this setup here, turn this one off, turn this one on, okay, and that was the extent of it, because there was no, even if I had wanted to relight everything, there was only so many places I could hide equipment and cords and the camera and my own shadow. And there's one part where there's a terribly violent scene in the cell, and I have to move across the door, and so and I didn't want to cast my shadow in the cell because I'm in the cell with them. And as I remember, we lit a certain way, this way, and so the lines from the bars are being cast in the back wall. And then I put another light opposing, and then we lined them up so that they're both casting, their shadows are on top of each other, so that it's one shadow. And that gave me a little space of like 2 or 3 feet where I could stand in the cell and look all around and not see myself. Wow. And you didn't know that, part of it wasn't dark. It was like, because it was, and depending on where the actor was, he had kind of a nice cross light. So as they move around, it was like you could get a sense of, and it had to be ominous, so I didn't have any fill in that. Mm-hmm. And it was a pretty intense scene. And that was a solution that I would never have like pre-planned. If somebody said, well, how are you gonna do this? I had no idea.
Yeah. Trying to figure out how to realistically light the prison, did you at all look at how the prison would normally be lit? Was that a reference for you?
Well, it was. It's funny because when I started in prep, I thought we had this opportunity for this one prison block. If I could have had 7 or 8 condors with 18Ks streaming light through it, could have been beautiful. Mm-hmm. we didn't have the money, but that was not our show, you know. And so I'd look at the prison and see what it really looked like. And in the late afternoon, you'd get some sunlight coming in, but because of the angle, it was so kind of oblique that it didn't really do what I was in my mind was thinking. And I just had to ask myself, do I want this because for me, or do I want this for the story? And in the end, I think I wanted it for the story because I think I wanted the high contrast that I could have gotten because it's really can highlight the darkness of the place. But in the end, we couldn't afford it, so we just went with a much more natural look and embraced it, and then just tried to, like I said, try to be more subtle in the choices. Just blow that out a little bit so you can't see that beautiful green hillside, and just reveal that terrible thing over there. And so I think the choices were much more subtle, and it probably better for it, even though I would have had fun with the, you know, with the 618Ks pouring through, but it would have been a different movie, I think.
Right.
At least those sequences, and it might have felt more imposed, like we were putting it on, and we didn't want to do that. We really wanted to. We wanted the prison to be a character. I mean, I think locations are characters. Things happen in specific places for a reason.
Well, to switch gears a little bit from kind of more real horror to fictional horror a bit more, but also going from more of a natural style to something that can be more stylized. I'd love to talk about Phantasm III and what it was like to shoot a horror film, especially one that you can kind of bend reality a little bit in.
Yeah, Phantasm III came to me kind of out of the blue, and that was exactly my thought was, I can do anything in this. This world can be anything. I'd never seen Phantasm II, but I remember Phantasm when I was a kid, when I was in high school, and I remember it being pretty scary. And then, but I knew this was the third in the series, so I got a copy from the director, and I watched Phantasm II beforehand, and I felt like it wasn't grounded in reality at all. It felt very comic-y, and also a lot of the, in Phantasm, there's these chrome spheres that fly around, and they stick in your head and drill a hole and pump out your blood and do these terrible things. And all of those flying shots were done in post, and I didn't think they were particularly believable. And so we had early conversations, and both the director, I don't know if I said it first or he said it, he probably did, but that we wanted to do all the flying shots in camera. That was from the beginning, and that was terrifying because I'd never done any kind of thing like that. And I was hired probably in December to start in earnest in January. So all Christmas holiday, I sat at home staring into a Christmas ornament going, where do I hide in this reflection?
Yeah.
And there's an answer to that, and I'll get to that. But when I read through the script, I thought, well, I just because it's a comic book doesn't mean it has to be ugly. It doesn't mean it has to be completely unbelievable. And certainly you can do things that are terrible. You have to be careful of that. I wanted the people to feel real, even though the situation is clearly not normal. And I had some very specific ideas about lighting faces. I still do. It's funny. I watched a sequence of it not long ago. I was doing some of the things that I still do, lighting faces then, which is interesting. Like, I do not like three-point lighting at all. I think it's an artificial construct that came up out of need during the portraiture era, and I think when people use three-point lighting as kind of their guide, they fall into a formula very quickly, and then the lighting does not inform the story at all. It's just it just bothers me, and so I work very hard to avoid it, which is interesting because sometimes in life it actually happens. Sometimes you're walking down the street and there's a moment when you're lit in a certain perfect way, and you think, oh, it is real, but it doesn't last. So it's fleeting. But I tend to key fill and if I have a backlight, all from the same side. And very often I don't use backlight. Very often I prefer to light the background and let the person fall off. It just feels more natural. It doesn't feel lit as much. Every light you turn on has a highlight and a shadow, and if you reveal those to people, then they know how many lights you're using. And most of the world, even though there may be light sources all around us, and again, occasionally we stand exactly between two and we're lit by both, but very often we're closer to one or the other, and the dominant lighting is single source. It's what feels more natural. It gives us a sense of volume, three-dimensional volume in a two-dimensional medium. And anyway, so I had these very specific ideas about that, which I did, but I felt like I could get away with all kinds of things color-wise. So one of the things I did is Lee has a gel called Congo Blue. I can't remember the number of it now, but I had this idea that, there's two kinds of scares. One is the jump scare where you're walking along and something jumps out at you and you scream. And the other is when you know something's coming and you're anticipating it and you don't know exactly when it's coming, but there's that anticipation. And I always found that the anticipation was more impactful. Like the scare lasts longer and you're terrified. So, but I think I don't want to undervalue the jump scare because those are also fun, right? So I had this idea that when I shoot the tall man, who's the bad guy, early, if I introduce this Congo blue light, just very subtly, a small highlight on something, a small reflection in something, that's kind of his light. And we did a couple of things that were interesting. Like, first thing I noticed is you can't light a chrome sphere because all you get is a point of light back at you, and it's not useful. But it's the same thing I said earlier about lighting different kinds of skin tones. If you light the environment around the sphere will reflect the environment. And so we had to go in and light the environment. Now, in several of the mausoleum shots, the sphere is flying. It's being flown on a fishing string. And there's a couple tricks to that. One is you don't light the string, you won't see it. Well, there's no light in the middle of the hallway. We're lighting everything that's reflecting. So it was, the sphere itself was kind of darker.
Yeah.
And so, so the string didn't show up well. And then because I had read somewhere, probably in Masters of Light, which is a great book, somebody talked about doing a fishing string gag, and they kind of drew with a magic marker like a dotted line. So if there was a highlight on the line, it wasn't continuous. It would get broken up, and we tried doing that. A couple places where we got too close to the sphere and couldn't hide it, we have a faux flat made with a hole cut in it, and that flat was to look like whatever the background was, so that it would be reflected. So that worked. So we had fun with it. I got a lot of leeway to kind of do what I wanted. There's a couple places I used some other funky colors that were just, I said, why not? We can make this world. We want to differentiate one space from another.
Is that something that you do a lot, like having a certain color, associated with a certain character, like with the tall man?
That's the only time I've ever done that, and that was my first real feature. I think I didn't have the sense that it was as successful of an idea as I was hoping it would be, so I don't think I've done it more. Having said that, absolutely we talk about color with characters, but often with wardrobe or production design. This person lives in a yellow house. This their furniture is blue and silver, and they're wearing kind of a blue suit. Or, we definitely assign colors to different characters, and I work with production design on that element. But I'm not relying so much on colored light too much.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like a much more stylized way of associating a character with color that would only work in something a little bit more out there, such as Phantasm III.
But you say that in so I did a movie called Sea of Dreams I mentioned earlier, and Sea of Dreams is a magical realism film, and it's it's essentially a young girl is born in this coastal village, and she's stillborn, and they baptize her into the ocean, and the ocean falls in love with her at that moment. And everybody else who loves her ends up dying in an ocean-related death. It's a jealous ocean. We wanted the ocean to be emotional, not to be like a Caribbean kind of tropical fish tank, but more like, the Mediterranean, kind of a sea with emotion. There's darkness in it, and the Gulf of Mexico was the other one. We ended up looking at locations in Italy and in Mexico. We ended up ultimately shooting in Mexico. In that, because the water is a very specific color, we talked about, photographing the water so it was beautiful and blue, but not aquarium beautiful, right? And so we'd look for certain days. We're like, oh, that's how we want the ocean to look. And we wanted to tie it in. So we were doing things with color to kind of feel the ocean's presence, even though, and some of it was colored light, but it wasn't necessarily like on the actors. So, and it culminated in the kind of the the climax of the film, there's a scene written where the jealous ocean, she is proposed to, she accepts the proposal, the jealous ocean rises up in the town, starts flooding the town, and everyone's freaking out. And when I first read it, I mentioned to the director and producer, I said, this scene's really intense, but it happens at 3 p.m. I think it'd be scarier if it happened at night. So they liked that idea, and so we decided to do what I ended up calling Black Day, which is we transitioned from day into night in a shot, back to night, so that this moment that happened in blackness and darkness, contrasting against the light, but it was really the middle of the day.
Yeah.
And so you get that sense like something really terrible is about to happen. The other thing that was a challenge on that, also related to color, is we knew that when you're shooting at the beach, you're shooting in certain places, you can't light them at night. There's just no way. So you have to do day for night. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do day for night, I had never done it before. Outside, I had done inside a tent house that's night, but if I was going to do it, I was like, I didn't want to give away the telltale secrets, and I thought the thing that's most obvious to me that day for night is the color. There's a color shift typically, and so in keeping with the idea of we wanted this ocean to be kind of this sapphire, kind of a jewel, I started experimenting day for night, and I stumbled on one idea completely accidentally, where I took 2 polarizers, one was linear, one was circular, and if you put them in a certain order and you turn them, things go kind of from warm to cool a little, but they don't really get darker. You put them in the other order, they go from lit to black, and that's kind of how those variable NDs work now. When both of them were on, the only light that exposed the film was specular light coming to the camera. Otherwise, shadows went black, and all the scattered light was absorbed. And I was like, that's really interesting. And what I learned is that under a certain light, a certain exposure, I would get a certain result that I liked. But you can't meter it when your meter's going to be reading scattered light and specular light. So it's just a gut feeling. You have to just pick an exposure based on the tests and go for it. And the first day we actually shot it, it wasn't the right conditions. It was a little overcast, but we had to shoot on this day, this scene. And so that took a little more guesswork. And when I first got dailies back from the lab, I got a call and the lab said, we have this problem with this shot. There's no detail. We keep trying to brighten it up. And I said, where are you printing it at? And they told me. And I said, no, print it at these numbers. And he said, I won't see anything. He said, just do it and let me know. And the next day I got a call saying, oh my God, it's beautiful. And I was like, okay, thank you. Now send me that so I can see it. What happened is the darkness goes like inky blue. I won't say black, but blue. The highlights were kind of sparkled, and where the sky meets the water kind of blends like it really does in real life, and you're like, wow, that, I don't know if it's day for night. It doesn't look like most nights, but it seemed right for it. It was very stylized, and it's dark enough that you'd buy it as a night. It was more blue than like my taste wanted, but it was appropriate for this story. And I've never done that again because I haven't had that story that's worked. I did another film that had day for night, and I had to figure out another way to do it because it was like, that was that story. It's not this story. And that brings me to like, I try to approach every project like it's a first in a way. Like, what would I do if I didn't know what I know? Because I don't want to say, oh, I know how to do this, let's do it that way, because that's boring, Because I think that if you're doing something that's truly creative, it's an experiment. And if you're doing something where the outcome is known, it's manufacturing. And while it's maybe true that to shoot matching coverage of something, I have to manufacture in a way, but the shots that establish the look of any scene and what that's going to be, that has to be creative, and that's exciting, and it can be scary.
Are there any, thoughts on lighting you'd like to wrap up with?
My one thought is, and this has been going on for years, since probably I've had this thought since the 80s, which is the one thing that people don't necessarily pay as much attention to is the quality of light. And I think the quality of light is so important in telling a story. It's so important having the audience feel the world, even though they're only seeing it. Like, you can get something exposed properly at the right level, and it can be the right color, and it comes from the right place, but if the quality isn't right, if it doesn't have the right amount of softness, the right amount of hardness, doesn't respond the way the emotional content of the scene wants it to respond, it has it to me it just feels mechanical, and it doesn't feel natural, because even though you got 3 out of 4, you're missing the thing that I think is least tangible. I think that it's harder to talk about. Like, I can tell you, I need 10-foot candles to get an exposure. That's easy, but can I tell you, like, I need a source of a certain kind of softness or hardness? That's much more esoteric and much more kind of personal. And sometimes it's hard because you think, well, if I really want this soft enough, I need to have a bigger unit. And if I have a bigger unit, maybe I need more power, and maybe there's a cost to it. And I get that. And so, like, for me, I rarely light exteriors. I sometimes do if I have to, but generally I try to work with bounce and negative, because if I have a light on you and a cloud comes over and blocks out this, makes everything darker, but you don't change exposure, if everything else does, it looks weird.
Right.
But if I'm using reflectors and a cloud comes over, everything kind of comes down together. It looks more.
Yeah, it's more organic.
And so I feel like people should pay attention to those kinds of things, and also remember that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. I mean, but I think everybody has to develop what they like, their individual taste. I think that's one of the great things about when you're learning something in the beginning, you naturally gravitate towards trying to emulate the people you respect or admire or want to be like or whatever. But at some moment, and you may not even be aware of it, you stop trying to emulate them and you start doing what you want to do, and your version of that. And that's when you kind of take over and you've become, now you're ready to do your thing. And I think there's room for all of us, because we all are somehow slightly different and have our own perspectives to share and to work from. And I think that's amazing.
I mean, I think it goes a lot to, the things you said you have noticed that are similar throughout your work when, if it's not having 3-point lighting versus, what does change with the story. There's room for kind of a thumbprint of personality in there that also works with the individual story being told.
Hopefully.
I mean,
so I'm always trying to somehow put the story into the subtext, whether it's something on the set or through color or light or movement or whatever. But some of these examples are so bold in how they just grab you by the hand and lead you and don't show it to you, and you leave knowing, and you're like, oh my, that's mastery, and it's not practiced enough. So.